Two major political parties in South Korea are gearing up for the presidential election set for June 3rd. The Democratic Party has pledged to relocate the presidential office to Sejong City as it begins its partisan campaign, while 8 candidates from the Conservative People Power Party picked groups for debates that will be held this weekend. The Bank of Korea has decided to keep the country's key interest rate steady at 2.75%, amid heightened concerns over unstable exchange rates for the Korean won against the US dollar. The South Korean government has announced that it will return the medical school enrollment quota to the previous level. This comes as trainee doctors and medical students have been going on strike for over a year in protest against plans to expand medical school admissions. It's April 17, 8 p.m. in Seoul. This is Newscenter. Thank you for joining us. I'm Peunji, filling in for Yoon Jung-min. The Democratic Party of Korea's primaries are being held by region, and their first stop is Chungcheongdo, a place considered a key battleground in presidential elections. Meanwhile, 8 contestants of the People Power Party are now getting ready for debates set for this weekend. Our National Assembly correspondent Kim Do-yeon starts us off.
Preliminary presidential candidates from the Democratic Party of Korea unveiled their strategies to boost growth in the Chungcheongdo provinces on Thursday, coinciding with the start of online voting by DP electors the day before. All 3 candidates shared a common pledge to fully establish Sejong City, located within Chungcheongdo, as South Korea's administrative capital, proposing to relocate the presidential office there. This pledge also follows a move by impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol, who previously relocated the presidential office from the Blue House to Yongsan, a decision heavily criticized by the DP as an unnecessary budget expenditure and notably the site of his martial law declaration. Chungcheongdo remains a crucial battleground for presidential candidates. Notably, the winner of this region has also secured victory in the last 7 presidential elections. Meanwhile, the People Power Party held a media day for its primary contestants on Thursday. With 8 contestants, they broke the first round debates into 2 groups by topic: Future for the Young Generations and Social Unity. The Future for the Young Generations debate will be held by Yoo Jung-bok, An Cheol-soo, Kim Moon-soo, and Yang Yang-ja on Saturday. Social Unity by Lee Cheol-woo, Na Kyung-won, Han Dong-hoon, and Hong Jun-pyo on Sunday. The People Power Party also launched its preparatory committee for the presidential election. Chaired by lawmaker Yoon Jae-ok, the committee is set to prepare for the PPP presidential election campaign once the party's candidate is chosen. Yoon said it's long overdue as the prep should have started before, but said the tortoise beat the hare. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The National Assembly today voted down contentious bills that have been vetoed by the acting president. These include a special investigation bill related to former President Yoon Suk-yeol's declaration of martial law. Our correspondent Shin Ha-young reports.
The political standoff between rival parties over contentious bills continues in the National Assembly ahead of the early presidential election. The National Assembly on Thursday voted down a Democratic Party-led bill calling for a special investigation into former President Yoon Suk-yeol's declaration of martial law last December and the related insurrection charges. In an anonymous vote, of the total 299 votes cast, 197 voted for the bill and 102 voted against. The bill was vetoed in January by then acting President Choi Sang-mok and sent back to the parliament for a revote. For a bill already vetoed to pass, it requires approval from 2/3 or more of the lawmakers present, in addition to a majority attendance. During Thursday's plenary session, the Assembly also voted down a bill that had been sent back for a revote, which called for a special probe into a political broker called Myung Tae-gyun. The DP in February unilaterally passed a bill seeking to investigate allegations of election fraud involving former President Yoon, former First Lady Kim Gun-hee, and Myung. Ahead of the session, the rival parties issued sharp messages over the bills up for a revote.
It's time for the PPP to break ties with Yoon Suk-yeol, who was removed from office. If they oppose the special investigation again, it will clearly show they're siding with insurrection and acting against the Constitution.
These are populist and unjust bills that the DP pushed through without sufficient public consensus or regard for national interests and people's livelihoods, just to strengthen its political position.
The parliament also rejected a Commercial Act amendment which was vetoed by acting President Han Duck-soo earlier this month. The bill sought to revise the Commercial Act to add the word shareholders to the director's duties from just company in efforts to tackle the so-called Korea discount. Meanwhile, driven by the DP, the Assembly passed a motion to fast-track a bill introducing a special act aimed at boosting the domestic semiconductor industry. The People Power Party wants to introduce a special act that would provide chip companies an exemption from the current labor law so that employees in the sector can work for more than the current limit of 52 hours per week. On the other hand, the DP wants to exclude this special exemption and instead lay out other means to support the industry. At maximum, fast-track bills can take up to 330 days to pass, including going through reviews by the Standing and Judiciary Committees, followed by a final vote at a plenary session. Sejong, Arirang News.
In other news, the government is reversing its earlier expansion of medical school seats in a bid to resolve its protracted standoff with current students and junior doctors. Our Sejong explains.
The government announced on Thursday that the 2026 medical school enrollment quota will be returned to the 2024 level of 3,058 students.
We will push for a legal amendment to allow universities to adjust their 2026 medical school enrollment quotas to the 2024 levels.
Last year, the government raised the quota by 2,000 to 5,058. But doctors and medical students strongly opposed the move, alleging it would hurt training conditions. This led to a wave of leaves of absence among medical students, resulting in a significant gap in their medical education. Presidents of 40 medical schools proposed that the government restore the original quota for 2026 admissions if all first-year students return to class. The government accepted the proposal on March 7th, but only if a sufficient number of students to ensure classes could proceed without disruption returned by the end of March. A surge in last-minute enrollments at the so-called Big Five medical schools led to that number being achieved. While many former students returned, a number opted to register but not attend. So even after reversing the quota increase, the government still has more to do to get these students back to classes and resolve the healthcare workforce shortage. This raises questions about the future of medical education.
We need to predict how the healthcare landscape will change 10 to 20 years from now. And based on that vision, we should determine how many medical professionals we need and what kind of education they should receive.
Universities are now required to submit revised admissions plans that reflect the updated quota to the Korean Council for University Education by the end of this month. The proposed changes will then be reviewed and finalized following KCUE approval, expected around May. Sejong, Arirang News.
South Korea's central bank has left its base rate unchanged following the latest policy board meeting, a decision that comes amid mounting economic uncertainty at home and abroad. For more on this, we have our economic correspondent Moon Hae-ryun in the studio with us. Hae-ryun, thank you for joining us.
And thank you for having me.
So tell us more about the interest rate and the Bank of Korea's decision today.
That's right. So the Bank of Korea today kept its benchmark interest rate steady at 2.75% as widely expected. It announced the decision on Thursday following the third Monetary Policy Committee meeting of the year, taking a break after a quarter-point cut in February.
Considering the overall uncertain conditions, we decided to maintain our policy stance toward rate cuts, but judged that it would be appropriate to keep the base rate at its current level this time and observe further how domestic and external policy conditions evolve.
The central bank emphasized that it would maintain the current rate while carefully monitoring changes in both domestic and global conditions. Unstable exchange rates for the Korean won against the greenback amid trade and political uncertainties had fueled expectations of a rate freeze. Earlier this month, the exchange rate between the won and the US dollar peaked at its highest in 16 years before plummeting to its lowest for the year. Currently, the interest rate gap between the US and South Korea stands at 1.75 percentage points. A further widening of the gap could drive more capital outflows, placing additional downward pressure on the won.
So how does the Bank of Korea diagnose South Korea's economy at present?
So the BOK it currently assessed a rather downbeat economic growth for the country. The bank acknowledged that economic growth slowed more than expected in the first quarter. Political uncertainties and deteriorating trade conditions have hit both exports and domestic demand. The BOK now expects South Korea's growth rate this year to fall below its February projection of 1.5%, emphasizing the highly uncertain trajectory contingent on global trade negotiation outcomes. In short, the economic outlook is not just dim, but also increasingly uncertain. One of the most closely watched variables is inflation. In March, the consumer price index rose 2.1% on year, and core inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy prices, climbed 1.9%. Both remain in line with earlier forecasts, suggesting inflation is relatively stable. However, officials warn that a high exchange rate could still put upward pressure on prices. Despite this, demand-side inflation pressures are weak, and falling global oil prices may help keep inflation close to the 2% mark. That gives the BOK some breathing room to focus more on supporting growth. In a broader context, we're also seeing financial markets become more volatile. Stock prices dipped over concerns about the global economy, and although there's been a partial rebound, investors remain cautious.
Right, and what can we expect from future monetary policy decisions going ahead?
So towards the end of last year, it looked as though we'd have around 2 rate cuts by the end of this year. But with this latest interest rate freeze, experts are saying that the most likely scenario is 3 or more cuts within the year. The BOK has signaled that while it's open to further rate cuts, any moves will likely be gradual and data-driven. One expert pointed out that the US rate policy is one major factor for the BOK to take into account, so let's take a listen.
Tariffs are a major issue, but they are not the only one. One key factor is the U.S. Federal Reserve. Fed Chair Jerome Powell has made it clear that the Fed is in no rush to cut rates. If the Fed keeps rates high, that limits the BOK's room to maneuver without currency outflows.
But some analysts say that the BOK is now shifting its focus. Instead of placing all the weight on currency stability, it may be worth looking more closely at the domestic economy.
Korea's exchange rate against the dollar is also affected by the dollar index, the Japanese yen, and the Chinese yuan. So rather than making decisions based solely on the exchange rate, the outlook is that the Bank of Korea will start focusing more on the domestic economy.
Indeed, the Bank of Korea said it would continue to monitor changes in both domestic and global conditions, signaling that further rate cuts remain on the table, but with a cautious approach.
All right, Arirang, thank you for your report today.
Thank you for having me.
The government launched a larger and more efficient new tariff response system on Thursday. The Ministry of Economy and Finance announced in a meeting headed by First Vice Minister Kim Bum-seok that its original task force supporting orders and exports has been rededicated as the one-stop tariff response support headquarters to deal with trade uncertainty. Earlier in the day, Trade Minister Chung In-kyo pledged swift and coordinated action with relevant agencies as he forecast that U.S. tariffs would begin impacting exports in the second quarter. The meeting comes ahead of next week's visit to the U.S. by Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok and Trade Minister An Deok-gun, who are both set to carry out trade negotiations in Washington. Now, over in the U.S., Japanese trade officials and their American counterparts met for talks on tariffs as Tokyo seeks exemptions from the levies slapped by Washington. U.S. President Donald Trump hailed the meeting, saying big progress was made. Our Park Jun-an has the details.
The United States and Japan agreed to finalize a trade agreement as soon as possible during their Wednesday meeting in Washington. Japanese Economic Revitalization Minister Ryosei Akazawa said that while the U.S. was seeking to conclude the agreement within the 90-day suspension period for reciprocal tariffs, Tokyo was approaching the talks with caution, and the future course of the negotiations remained uncertain. During the talks, Akazawa expressed deep regret over President Donald Trump's tariff measures, noting that Washington had already imposed 25% tariffs on steel and automobiles, and is set to apply a 24% reciprocal tariff on Japanese goods.
For my part, I said that the United States tariff measures are deeply regrettable. I explained Japan's position regarding the impact on Japanese investment and hiring, both in Japan and in the United States, and strongly requested that the U.S. review its series of tariff measures.
After meeting the Japanese trade delegation, President Trump noted on his social media that it was a great honor and added big progress. According to Kyodo News, Washington is believed to have demanded higher defense spending by Tokyo, or a larger share of the costs associated with maintaining U.S. military forces in Japan as part of any tariff reduction agreement, even though the two parties did not reveal the specifics of their conversation. Akazawa explained that the two countries had agreed to reschedule the next round of talks to be held within April and to continue discussions at both the working and ministerial levels. Meanwhile, the U.S.-Japan talks were viewed as a reference point for South Korea ahead of Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok's visit to Washington next week. Park Jun-han, Arirang News.
In related news, the U.S. Federal Reserve has acknowledged the likelihood of higher consumer prices and lower growth prospects in the face of rampant U.S. tariffs on its trade partners. Our Park Kwon-woo has this report.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has warned that the Trump administration's recent tariff policies could pose risks to the U.S. economy.
The level of tariff increases announced so far is significantly larger than anticipated, and the same is likely to be true of the economic effects, which will include higher inflation and slower growth.
Speaking at the Economic Club of Chicago on Wednesday, Powell said the tariffs are highly likely to cause at least a temporary rise in inflation, adding the impact could be more persistent. While the Fed aims to find a balance between keeping inflation at around 2% and maximizing employment, Powell said tariffs are leading the Fed to move away from those goals.
We will balance our maximum employment and price stability mandates, keeping in mind that without price stability, we cannot achieve the long periods of strong labor market conditions that benefit all Americans.
However, Powell also said the central bank will remain patient, holding off on any policy changes until it has a better understanding of how the current trade policies play out. Following Powell's remarks, U.S. stocks tumbled on Wednesday. The tech-heavy Nasdaq dropped more than 3%, while the S&P 500 and Dow Jones Industrial Average also fell. Also on Wednesday, gold prices soared, once even hitting an all-time high of just over $3,357 per ounce. Park Kwon-woo, Arirang News.
Organizers of the 2025 APEC summit, which will be held in South Korea's ancient southern city of Gyeongju this coming November, are now looking to move from the planning phase to the execution stage. Speaking at a related meeting this Thursday, Acting President Han Duck-soo highlighted the significance of this latest annual summit as it comes amid much uncertainty over global trade given the changes it currently faces. He further pointed to prospects of new investment in South Korea as corporate leaders look to attend the gathering as well. And in other news, South Korea and the U.S. on Thursday kicked off their 2-week combined air drill. Some 1,100 personnel and 90 aircraft from both countries have been mobilized for the semi-annual Freedom Flag. Their missions include air interdiction, counter-air operations, and wartime defense rehearsal. Freedom Flag combines 2 existing exercises, the annual Combined Air Force Composite Training and vigilant defense. An intriguing collection of relics belonging to Korea's independence activists will go on auction this spring at an auction house here in Seoul. There's greater meaning as this year marks the 80th anniversary of Korea's independence. Our Yoon has a glimpse.
Revered Korean independence activist of the Japanese colonial era, An Jung-gun. As a part of his previously unreleased collection of calligraphic work left behind in the final days leading up to his execution, this piece, titled Nokjuk, or Green Bamboo, is presumed to have been created in February of 1910. This piece is different from his usual vertical writing, while his signature handprint is also imprinted horizontally. Han Yong-un was a Buddhist reformer, poet, and independence activist, also known by his pen name Manhae. This folding screen contains poetry of his that compares the path of Buddhist practice to the journey of a young monk to find his lost cow. It is a rare 10-panel masterpiece showcasing Manhae's unique round handwriting.
Manhae believed in the people continuing towards the independence of our country during the Japanese occupation. And through this poem, he wanted to remind us that it is a destination that should not be forgotten.
Seoul Auction's spring session will have a large number of such relics containing traces from the independence movement. In addition to the works of An Jung-gun and Han Yong-un, there will be the first edition of Yoon Dong-ju's book of poems titled Sky, Wind, Star, and Poem, showing the passage of time in its worn-out cover page, as well as documents like records of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. These items can range in value from tens to hundreds of thousands of US dollars. Garnering great interest due to this year marking the 80th anniversary of Korean independence, the relics will be shown in a free exhibition until April 21st, a day before the auction on the 22nd. 이은진, Arirang News.
It felt like summer is here already. Looking at the map, inland areas red on the map exceeded 25 degrees Celsius, with the temperature in Seoul reaching 24 degrees, 27 degrees in Kimcheon. We've seen early summer-like conditions nationwide already. As the daytime temperature rises significantly, temperature swings come around as well. Please take care of your health. In addition to warm conditions, strong winds are blowing every day, with strong winds of around 50 meters per second across the country today, and gusty winds of around 20 meters per second blowing in the mountainous areas of Jeju Island until dawn tomorrow. Tomorrow morning, Seoul and Chuncheon will start off at 13 degrees, Gyeongju at 14 degrees. Daily highs will move up to 21 degrees in Seoul, 29 degrees in Daegu and Gyeongju. More rain is forecast across the country this weekend. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for our panel session coming up next.